We are here tonight to listen about a group of 16 guys. They happen to be Ming emperors. They happen to come at a time when China was again in turmoil, and they were throwing off their Mongol, their foreign yoke, and placing themselves in the center of Chinese life. This family is from southern China, from the area near Nanjing. And in that particular area, they were able to wrest the Yangtze Basin first, and then North China, and drive out the Mongol horde. They were in power for 178 years, over 3 centuries of time. They came before the modernization process struck the Europeans, so within no time they were the greatest power on earth. These 16 guys were not necessarily nice. They often killed their sons or someone else's son to stay on the throne. They also were inspired by the sense of their mighty rule across the Han nation. So when you see them in their public dress, they are the dragon emperors. They have a 5-clawed dragon. They are dressed in a magnificent regalia, mainly in Chinese gold and silk. Their color was the yellow. No one else wore it. Some of their sons got very ambitious and occasionally put themselves in an outfit with 4 claws on the dragon, but never 5. They were awe-inspiring both to the internal nature of Chinese civilization, that is, by the end of the Ming time, there were 60,000 people living within the Forbidden City. The Forbidden City is their creation, a magnificent civic edifice, as is the Temple of Heaven that gives a stamp on what Beijing looks like even today. The awe that they inspired among their own people also spread to the awe that they inspired to all people they met. And they had a great opportunity. The population exploded under them, so that within a decade, there were more people living in China than were living in all. All the states of Western Europe. They had 1 million men under arms. They repaired and extended the Great Wall. They excavated, drained, and enlarged the famous Grand Canal between Beijing and Nanjing, northern capital, southern capital, linking the 2 great river valleys together. All this in due time. And then they had a shipyard that you would never believe on the banks of the Yangtze at Nanjing. And there they built fleets that went down the coast of Southeast Asia into the Indian Ocean and across to India and up to Arabia and then down back to India and back to China. And on those voyages, often of 40 large ships, they gave an awe-inspiring view of Chinese civilization to all the people that they met. At the zenith of their control, they had beginnings of the scientific revolution. That is, when you saw all these, and you'll see them in Michael's photos, magnificent textiles, you suddenly recognize that there had to be a textile industry to support 60,000 people dressed in all these wonderful robes. When you saw all of this naval architecture, you had to understand that they knew all about going to sea beyond the borders where you could not see land anymore. They had a compass. When you see the iron fittings that are on various items, you understand that they had iron works. When you understand that at the royal kilns outside of Beijing, at the height of their power, in 1 year they received 1 million orders at those kilns for items to be made. When you go to places as far away as Istanbul, you find that the Sultans ate on blue and white porcelain china made during the time of the Ming. So all of this gives you a little view of 16 guys who ruled China at the height of its power. And now I'm going to let Michael show you some of that power. Michael Knight is the senior curator of Chinese art at the Asian Art Museum. He's been with us several times. Last time we had a wonderful show with him on the Shanghai exhibit that was at the Asian last year. And he has a PhD from Columbia. He's also taught at the University in Washington. So he's well-traveled. He will be coming with a new show soon to the Asian, but for right now, he's giving us a relook at something that happened 2 weeks ago. Humanities West did a wonderful weekend of the Ming Dynasty, everything about them, their music, their art, their clothing, their dancing. And Michael has promised not to dance tonight, but he will show you the magnificent art of the court, the Ming. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Knight.
Thank you. Goodness. I think we're almost done. He gave all my information already. So, Ming Court Arts. When I started in this business, which was 30-odd years ago, when we looked at pieces like this, the main approach was to talk about technique, how such pieces were made. And there's a lot to be said about that. I don't have my pointer, so I'll use the cursor here. This piece was made during the reign of the Hongwu Emperor, so the very first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. And it's a marvelous dragon, kind of derived from the Yuan dragon. So we can talk about the dragon and what it means. We can talk about techniques, the making of porcelain and what's required to make porcelain, how high it's fired, how difficult it is to get a red, in this case, underglaze copper red. That requires a straight-up, very elaborate, very controlled kiln and a reduction firing. Anything gets in there that's not reduction, it turns gray. So getting it red was very difficult. And that's how these conversations went. And most of the publications went along those lines as well. What it took to make these kinds of ceramics and so on and so forth. The piece on the near side here from the reign of the Beijing emperor. So this is done in the 16th century, and there's quite a bit that changes in between. Again, we can talk about technique, and that would have been the way to talk about them before, is to talk about the introductions of overglaze enamels and how that added a whole series of new decorative effects and how those enamels were applied and so on and so forth. Those of you who have heard Therese Bartholomew speak know that in between that time and now, there's been a lot of exploration, particularly by her, on what these various symbols mean. So when you have goldfish, that's Jinyu, that's gold and jade, that means wealth and good fortune, and there are whole stories being made by the decorative schemes that go on these objects, and that really developed at a very high level during the Ming. So we get a better idea along the way about what these things mean. There's a little less known about how they function, and that's something what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. These also occurred in a historical context. As Dr. Hatcher was saying, 16 emperors over the long period from 1368 to 1644, that was the Ming Dynasty, a lot happened in that time, and things changed over that period of time. If we talk about these pieces in a historical context, the piece on the far side there, the one with the dragons, made at the very beginning of the Ming. The main taxation system at that time was taxation in terms of labor, corvée labor. So if you were a potter and you were in the area of the Jingdezhen where these kilns were located, for a certain amount of the year, your taxation would be paid in labor at the kilns. You'd actually go to the kilns and you would work at the kilns and you would help make these pieces. As the Ming evolved, as time changed, what happened? Any ideas? Silver came from the Americas in great amounts. Huge amounts of silver came to the Americas, and taxes began to be paid in silver. So what happens then at the imperial kilns is people are paying their taxes in silver rather than paying it in labor, and you get a real professional core group that is there all the time. So you get real changes and real developments in what's going on at the kilns because you have this whole professional labor force that's there full time now. So really from the 1500s on, you have that change and the discussion of how silver and the kind of global economy affects Chinese art throughout is a very fascinating one and a complicated one. But great amounts of silver were coming. The system was being monetarized, taxes were being paid in money, and professional laborers were being used to create these kilns. So that's quite a difference. In 1597 at Jingdezhen, this is in Jiangxi province, there were 168 workshops, 70 kilns, 66 storage areas, 104 areas for wood storage. You want to talk about deforestation? The annual firing of these kilns meant for a lot of wood being used up, and a lot of southern China was deforested. And so on and so forth, taking about 54,300 square meters of space. This was a huge, huge industrial complex. The creation of these ceramics in the 16th century was divided into 72 steps, each one very, very specialized. So this was the division of labor. This was mass production, something that didn't happen in the West until quite a bit later. China was truly the world's leading industrial power until the second industrial revolution in the 1850s. This kind of level of production, the ability to create things in this kind of number and this kind of specialization didn't exist anywhere else in the world until much, much, much later. As Dr. Hatcher was saying, in the 16th century, in yearly orders of ceramics from Jingdezhen could be as many as 1 million pieces. So these were huge firings. And these were at the imperial supervised kilns. There were also private kilns, a variety of different kinds of kilns, producing materials for a whole range of different markets in the same area. So the level of specialization, the level of production, the amount of material being put out on the market was enormous. So again, a very complicated and rather fascinating kind of series of stories that can be told about that. So here's that jar. One of the things that the third emperor of the Ming Dynasty did, this is the Yongle emperor who reigned in the early part of the 15th century, what he started doing was applying these marks on the bottoms of these jars. So on the bottom of this jar, down here underneath, Da Ming, Jiajing, Yanqi. So made in the reign of Jiajing of the Great Ming. Good and bad about this. Jiajing is the name of a reign. It's not the reign of a person. It's not the name of a person. This is true of Yongle. This is true of Hongwu. This is true of Qianlong. Those are names of reign periods. They're not the names of actual people. And what has happened that's become common parlance amongst all people dealing with China is to use that as Yongle did such and such. Qianlong did such and such. Well, that's not quite correct because it isn't Yongle. Yongle is not a person. Yongle is a period. Jiajing is a period, 1522 to 66. So an interesting kind of thing, but they did this. So we have these marks. So we have a really good idea. We don't have to kind of guess by stylistic criteria what the objects from a particular reign look like. We know because they put the dates on the bottom. Of course, having this on the bottom of the piece, if you're a connoisseur, means it's no earlier than that, but it could be any date later than that. So there's still connoisseurship involved in looking at Chinese porcelains. So there were 16 of these guys, and we've talked about that a little bit already, so let's go on to the next of them. The first group, I've got 9 of them up, 9 of the 16. So, and the first, if you look at them, these guys, big, kind of hefty, military-looking guys, right? They really have a presence on the stage. So these guys had their own issues to deal with. The Hongwu emperor, the very first emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, that's his real name, of course, had just taken over from the Mongols, and he was establishing a whole infrastructure of kind of court rituals, court structures, how to rule this new dynasty. So he was setting up this whole structure, and he was setting up the fact that he had the right to rule. That's one of the things that he needed to establish, is that he had the right to rule. And Chinese emperors ruled through what is called the mandate of heaven. Anybody here not know what the mandate of heaven is about? Good, then I don't have to talk about that too much. They had to actually prove that they had this mandate, that heaven had given this mandate to rule. Timothy Brooke has done an interesting little article on about dragons, because dragons were the voice of heaven. And the dragons were also the symbol of the emperor. So the emperor, only the emperor could wear that 5-clawed dragon, and that was a symbol of the emperor. But when people saw dragons, that means, so if there was a dragon sighting, an actual dragon sighting recorded as a portent or an omen, that was problematic, because that meant that heaven was saying that things were perhaps not so good, and maybe the emperor was losing his mandate. So dragons were both good and bad. They were the symbol of the emperor and had a lot of positive symbolism that way. But if somebody saw a dragon and reported it to the emperor, there were problems. And when lots of dragons were being sighted, and those appear in the court records, dynastic change is about to come. So we see a lot more of those as we get late into the Ming Dynasty. But if we look at these guys, the Yongle Emperor, he offed his nephew. He actually killed the emperor at the time, or is thought to have, and took over the dynasty on his own, became the Yongle Emperor, the Emperor of Everlasting Happiness, an interesting title. He also had issues then with legitimacy and had to really establish these reasons for his rule, his right to rule. So this whole system of rituals and ceremonies developed in Ming Dynasty at the very beginning and developed from that time on and became an important part of what happened at the court. As you go later in the dynasty and you come down to these poor guys down here, they kind of shrink, huh? And they shrink and are almost invisible in their surroundings. And that's also true in their life as emperors. They become dominated by this whole structure of ritual and ceremony. And what their arts were being used for was really directed towards maintaining that, but also it kind of consumed them. So this is China during the Ming. How many of you actually know that there were two capitals during the Ming Dynasty? Yeah, there are a few. So there was a southern capital and a northern capital. And as Dr. Hatcher was saying, the Jew family actually came from this area, and their first capital was right here in Nanjing. Nanjing actually translates as southern capital. And that was the capital from 1368 until 1420 or so. And it remained the secondary capital throughout the entirety of the Ming. So for the entirety of the Ming Dynasty, there were two capitals. The primary capital, which we all know is Beijing, and the secondary capital in Nanjing. And Nanjing, if you ever get a chance to go, it's really worth visiting and worth looking at the remains of the old Ming capital that was there. This capital since it wasn't the capital during the following Qing Dynasty, it remained pretty much intact, untouched, as a Ming city until the Taiping rebellions in the 1850s when it was destroyed. So it had remained more or less intact. When we did our Ming exhibition, we were able to get some really great objects from the Nanjing Municipal Museum because those things had remained almost entirely intact until they were destroyed in the 1850s, and then they were just laying there, but they didn't turn into dust. They were still in pretty good shape. But you can also wander around Nanjing and find these wonderful old walls from the Ming Dynasty, the Ming Dynasty walls, and they're pretty cool. And they actually tell you a lot about how things were constructed and the way things were ordered and where they came from and so on and so forth. It's really quite a fascinating place to go. But we really know the capital is Beijing, and this was the main capital. Really, the construction started there by this Emperor of Everlasting Happiness, the Yongle Emperor. In 1406, it became the primary capital in 1420, and this is the capital that we all know the best. And as you look at it, and as Dr. Hatcher was saying, by the end of the dynasty, there were some 60,000 members of the imperial family living in this area and areas surrounding. It was a big, big city. It's divided kind of into, you can't really say public and private, but in those areas that are more ceremonial or official and those that are more private. So there are kind of two divisions in that. And as you go to the city today, you still see that. You have those areas that are more now very, very public. It certainly never looked like that in the Ming Dynasty. And if you go there now, it's kind of, you've got to get your elbows out to get around. And then these more private areas where the emperors and the families actually lived. Those of you who have the opportunity to wander around, be sure you go back into these areas because they're pretty cool if they let you in. This is an area that you won't get in because this is where the Palace Museum, which occupies this structure, has their storerooms. These are photographs we were taken while we were selecting objects for the Ming exhibition that we did in 2008. So the big public spaces and then the more private spaces. This is an interesting little album, of some 40 leaves in the Palace Museum, so in Beijing, that actually shows the stages in the life of the Ming official Xu Xianqing. So it's a later part of the Ming. It's in the 16th century. And it gives a very good idea of what, a kind of a contemporary view of what might have been going on, one for an official, but also for the emperor. The emperor had his problems with these people, these officials who ran his bureaucracy. They were always telling him he was about to lose the mandate, or he was doing things wrong, or he was doing this or doing that incorrectly. And he had a need to show them that he was the person in control. He had the need to show heaven, but he also had the need to show these people. So a lot of the art that's in the more public or the more official areas of the court were meant to do that. They were to show that he was the emperor, he had the right to rule. So, in fact, the kind of content, the content or the symbolism was as important or perhaps even more important than the actual function. Does that make sense? In other words, it says I'm the emperor. That's what's really important, whether it's a bowl or something else. And how that bowl was